with a variety of equations. So real quick, we're going to talk about what this actually looks like and what we're actually finding. So if I look at this little graph of this parabola, I have my y-axis, and this point right here, so the vertical line, that's my y-axis. This point right here is my y-intercept. Let's say that has a point of 0, 3. If I go above that, a point or 2 points, we're going to be at 0, 5. Up further, 0, 10. We have 0, 1, 0, 2. So everywhere on the y-axis, what is the x value for that coordinate? 0. So when we actually find the y-intercept, we are substituting 0 for x, and usually we're just evaluating, meaning we just do the math, but sometimes we have to solve. And the difference there is when you evaluate, you're just doing the order of operations to get your number. When you're solving, you are isolating that variable to get what it equals. For the most part, you're only going to have one y-intercept, and that's because functions can't have more than one y-intercept. But you can have multiple x-intercepts. There may be some exceptions to this only being one. But you can have multiple x-intercepts. And if you look at our graph again, I'll zoom back in, you can see that this particular parabola has two x-intercepts. Let's say they're at 1, 0, and -3, 0, and I'm just totally making those numbers up. But those are our two x-intercepts. This is our horizontal axis, that's our x-axis. So what does y equal at the x-intercept? 0. So, similarly with the x-intercept, we substitute 0 for y, and usually solve. So solve for x. Okay, so for our first example, 2x squared plus 9y equals 72. To find our x-intercepts, what are we going to put in for, to find our y-intercepts, what are we putting in for x? 0. So 2 times 0 squared plus 9y equals 72. 0 squared is 0 times 2 is 0, so this entire term adds out. So we're left with 9y equals 72. To solve that, what do we do? Divide by 9. So y equals 8. And technically, if we're writing our y-intercept, we're writing this as a coordinate. So the point would be 0, 8. I will accept y equals 8, but I also want to show you the correct way to write it. For the x-intercept, we substitute 0 in for y. So 2x squared plus 9 times 0 equals 72. 9 times 0 equals 0, so this adds out. 2x squared equals 72. A really common problem, or a common mistake that people make is to square root here. But what should I do first? I need to divide by 2 because I want to get that x squared alone before I square root. So I'm left with x squared equals 36. Now I'm going to square root. And what is the square root of 36? Is that is 6 the only thing?
And -6.
And -6. So, this answer is actually going to be plus or minus 6. And the reason for that is when we have this x squared, if we were to put this in a y equals form, this would be a parabola. This would be a quadratic equation, which would be a parabola. And so what that means, and this is just a sketch, is that that parabola is crossing both at positive 6 and at negative 6. So mathematically, sorry you couldn't see that, mathematically, when we take the square root of 36, we're trying to figure out what times itself gives you 36. So 6 times 6 is 36, but negative 6 times negative 6 is also a positive 36. So when we square root, we need to watch out for that plus or minus. So our two x-intercepts are 6, 0, and negative 6, 0. Any questions on that? One of the things that I did not read through in your notes there is if either equation cannot be solved, the intercept does not exist. So keep that in mind as we're looking at our next one. For the y-intercept, once again, I'm going to substitute in 0 for x. So y equals 5 over 2 times 0 minus 8. 2 times 0 is just 0, so I'm left with negative 8 on the bottom. So y equals negative 5/8. When it comes to fractions and negatives, it could be 5 over negative 8, it could be negative 5 over 8, or you can just have the negative out in front. Just make sure you're not writing the double negative if it doesn't exist. So negative 5/8 for our y-intercept. Now our x-intercept. 0 equals 5 over 2x minus 8. So the first thing I want to do is get this out of fraction form. So if I want to get rid of a fraction, what do I do? Multiply by the denominator. Very good. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2x minus 8. So the reason that I do that is if I multiply here, I am multiplying by 2x minus 8, and then I'm dividing by 2x minus 8. And what does that do when I do that? What happens? They divide out. So anything divided by itself gives you 1, and 1 times something doesn't change it. So what I'm left with on this side is 5. What am I left with over here? What am I left with? I'm left with 0. Because it's 0 times everything in here. So, I have 0 equals 5. Is that true? No. So what does that mean about my x-intercepts? They do not exist. So there are no x-intercepts. And I want to show you why that is. We'll get into it first. So if I put this into the calculator, 5 divided by parentheses 2x minus 8, and I graph it. Oh, and the battery died. Okay. Now it's a slightly punctured but not dead calculator. What I have here is what's called a hyperbola. We're going to learn more about this when we get into parent graphs, but there are a couple things that are happening here. So at my x-axis, right along here, the x-axis creates what is called an asymptote. And what that means is as this graph goes further positive in this direction, it's going to get infinitely close to the x-axis, but it's never ever going to touch it. And the same thing as we go further negative, from this point, it's going to get infinitely close but never touch it. So there are no x-intercepts on this graph. Another asymptote is created at x equals 4. So there would be, I really wish I could draw on this calculator, but there would be a vertical asymptote going down at x equals 4. Can anybody tell me why x cannot equal 4 in this particular equation. Yes, exactly. So if I substitute 4 in for x, then I would get 8 minus 8, which would give me 0. And in math, I am not allowed to divide by 0. If you divide by 0 on the calculator, it'll give you an error. So you cannot have 0 for a denominator. So, we'll talk more about that vertical and horizontal asymptote when we get to the parent graph section, but I wanted to kind of introduce that to you so you understood why, at least a little, why there were no x-intercepts there. Okay, moving on to the last example, and this isn't actually going to be our last one because I want to go over one more after this. The process is still going to be the same. So I have x squared over 100 plus y squared over 16 equals 1. So for my y-intercepts, I'm going to put in 0 for x. Squared is going to be 0, divided by 100 is still going to be 0. So, what I'm left with is y squared over 16 equals 1. What do I do to get rid of that 16? Multiply both sides by 16. So it divides out there. I'm left with y squared equals 16. And I'm going to square root both sides. And I end up with y equals what? Just 4? Plus or minus 4. So this is a situation where you have two y-intercepts. This particular equation is actually a circle, which isn't a function. A function can only have one y value per any x value. But this one is going to have two y-intercepts at both positive and negative 4. For your x-intercepts, x squared over 100 plus y squared, 0 squared, sorry, over 16. Again, that leaves me 0 there, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 100. X squared equals 100. Square root both sides, and x equals plus or minus 10. We're also going to do a standard quadratic because several people in my last couple classes had that question and couldn't quite remember how to solve this. So we're going to go over the two separate ways of solving problems like these. So the y-intercept is going to be your easy one to find, or your takes a lot less steps, I'll say that. So y equals 0 squared plus 12 times 0 plus 20. So y equals 20. Your x-intercepts, however, can be found in one of two ways. One of those is by factoring, and the other one is by using the quadratic formula. So I'm going to show you both ways, because factoring doesn't always work. It does in this particular case, but I'm going to show you both just so you have both of those skills. So first, factoring, because you can't isolate the variable here. If you have an x squared and an x, you can't isolate it, and you can't factor out just an x because the 20 doesn't have an x. So I'm going to show you all the steps, show what you need to show and what can be graded. So we have our x squared, 20, multiply those two to give us 20x squared on the top. Take our middle term, put that on the bottom. And then I need the factors of 20 that add up to 12. So 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 3 is not a whole number, 4 and 5, and then it'd be back to 5 and 4. So the pair that adds up to 12 is 2 and 10. So 2x and 10x. Then I factor out my greatest common factor from each row and column. So 2x and x squared, I mean x times x is x squared, x times 2 is 2x, x times 10 gives me 10x, and then you double check that 10 times 2 gives you 20. So your factored form is then 0 equals x plus 2 and x plus 10. So what that means is you're multiplying two factors, x plus 2 times x plus 10 to give you 0. So if you multiply anything together and they equal 0, what do you know about them? One of them is 0. So in this case, we're going to set them each equal to 0 because we have two different values that will make that whole thing 0. So x plus 2 equals 0, and x plus 10 equals 0. Minus 2, minus 10. We have x equals negative 2, and x equals negative 10. So that's using factoring to solve a quadratic equation, or to find your x-intercepts. The other method is the quadratic formula, because not all quadratic equations can be factored. We have the quadratic formula, and that is x equals, you might put this in your notes, in your notebook or something, just so you have it, negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times b, all divided by 2a. All kinds of cricket up there. So if I look at my equation that I'm dealing with, I have 0 equals x squared plus 12x plus 20. A is the number in front of x squared. So in this case, what is a? 1. Because I can put a 1 there without changing its value. So a equals 1, b equals 12, and c equals 20. Okay. So now I need to start plugging those in. So, push that back up. X equals negative 12, because the negative is part of the formula, plus or minus the square root of 12 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20, all divided by 2 times 1. And then I just need to start simplifying it. Negative 12 plus or minus 12 squared is 144. Something I want you to keep in mind when you're doing the quadratic formula is even if b is negative, a negative squared is always a positive. So this number, when you go from here to here, this number will always be positive. So just make sure that you're watching out for not letting the calculator make the error for you. Anything squared will always be positive. And then minus 4 times 1 is 4, times 20 is 80. So remember, you're multiplying those straight in a row. You're not distributing anything or anything like that. And then all divided by 2 for 2 times 1. And I'm showing all the steps in between because I skipped steps in my first class and everybody lost me. So 144 minus 80 is 64. So I've got negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 64 divided by 2. Square root of 64 is 8. This plus or minus handles that whole plus or minus thing, so it's there already. So negative 12 plus or minus 8 divided by 2. And this is where I split it up into the plus and the minus. So I have negative 12 plus 8, which gives gives me a positive, nope, just kidding, gives me a negative 4 divided by 2, which gives me negative 2. We do our negatives, so negative 12 minus 8 divided by 2. Negative 12 minus 8, that means we're at a negative number and we go further negative, so negative 20 divided by 2 gives me a negative 10. So, my two answers, you can see, match the two that we got from factoring. You're going to get the same answers. You don't have to do them twice. I was simply showing you both ways so that you are aware of how to do it both ways. But that is how you find your X and Y intercepts of probably any of them that you're going to need. Hopefully that covers it all.